Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to the Media and Society. My name is Anthony Mitchell, and we look forward to a spirited discussion with our guest, special guest, Lauren Harper-Pope. And we're going to have a good discussion about this year's politics and all that matters for not only just minority America, but all of America. Ms. Pope, thank you so much for coming to the Media and Society. I appreciate having you, and I look forward to a good discussion with you this evening.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me.
Okay, hey, let's get started. What you've been around politics as a strategist and advisor for some recognizable political campaign efforts in South Carolina. Do you mind telling the audience a bit about your journey and accomplishments in this field?
Absolutely. So I started my career actually working for a mayor. I worked for former Columbia Mayor Steve Benjamin in Columbia, South Carolina. And then I worked for Beto O'Rourke when he ran for president in 2019 as South Carolina State Director in the state. And then from there, I actually got connected to my co-founder, Liam, about the Welcome Party. And so that's when we co-founded the Welcome Party ahead of the 2020 presidential primary. And we essentially formed our organization to do what we call GOTV for Independence, which is get out the vote work for independent voters. He was working up in New Hampshire, where he's based in Boston area, and I was down in South Carolina, where I'm from. And we were essentially like, it's no one's job to do outreach to people who we perceive to be independent voters in the state. So let's try to get more independent people and even people who are less likely to vote in this primary, because as we know, a lot of times primaries are overlooked by regular voters. They're not necessarily, thinking about voting in February or June or whatever month the primary is in. And so when we do a lot of voter engagement, voter outreach to get more people to vote in a primary, it improves the quality of the candidates that we get on the ballot in November. So that's the reason why we started the Welcome Party, and not to make a third party, because we're not for third parties don't win, but to make a more welcoming Democratic Party where we welcome in moderate Republicans and independent voters into a Democratic coalition.
Interesting. So what I researched about you, getting to know you a little more, it looks like you're a part of some community organizations. You care to plug any of those that you serve with?
Absolutely. So I'm currently on the board of this group called South Carolina Women in Leadership. It's a group that tries to get more women in appointed and elected office in South Carolina. South Carolina is one of the worst states for women representation, which is really sad to see. I think we're ranked like literally 49th in the country for women in the legislature and other ranks of offices. So we do work to try to essentially get more women to run for office. So we provide resources and materials. It's called SE Will. I think it's like SE Will Lead or something like that, .org or whatever. So definitely check it out and give them some money, because we're doing a lot of nonpartisan, multi-partisan work for that.
That's great. That's great. You guys have an interesting election in
South Carolina is one
this.
something like that .org or whatever. So definitely check it out and give them some money, because so we do work to try to essentially get more women to run for office. So we provide resources and materials. It's called SE Will. I think it's like SE Will Lead or something like that .org or whatever. So definitely check it out and give them some money, because we're doing a lot of nonpartisan, multi-partisan work for that.
That's great. That's great. You guys have an interesting election in your home state this weekend. Which way do you want it to go? You don't have to answer that.
No, I mean, we're gonna have a fun, honest conversation tonight, Anthony. So I'm excited about our conversation.
Sounds good.
I honestly, I don't expect anything but a Trump victory.
Yeah.
South Carolina is a very red state, which is why I'm not even really able to do the work that I do with Welcome Party and Welcome PAC in South Carolina, because we just haven't really made the margins and redistricting that we need to do in the state to make it so that Democrats can win more, because of lots of gerrymandering, obviously. But say all that to say, not expecting anything but a big Trump win. People in South Carolina love him, and there are several moderate Republicans who have been supporting former ambassador and governor Nikki Haley. I just don't necessarily see her getting very far, unfortunately, in our home state.
Yeah, it's interesting when you listen to her. She brings up some good points at times, but then I just don't think she has and I hate to say it, that I don't think she has the charisma that is required. It's not like how Hillary always had charisma to be successful as a politician, but seems like she just didn't have, this one just doesn't have the charisma that's needed for her people to like her. And she actually did some positive things when she was in office as a governor there. So, which is interesting to me. What do you think about the education, the voter education within places like South Carolina, some of these smaller states?
Well, I think civic education, just as a whole, in our across our country nationally, is at not the best place. I think there are a lot of people who are particularly like Gen Z and even I think it's Gen Alpha who are like the little kids.
Hmm.
They are using technology. They know how to Google everything, which is awesome. But they're not necessarily being taught those things historically in the schools as well. I think that we can do a lot better when it comes to civic education in public schools, particularly at K through 12 levels, which obviously kids have to go to. And then that kind of trickles up to like whenever they get to be adults, they don't necessarily understand exactly how government works. They don't necessarily understand why politics does different things. And I think that the more that we educate voters, which is part of the reason why we started the Welcome Party, is hey, you have an election coming up. Here's who's in that election, and you can vote in this election. Different states have different laws about who can vote in primary elections. Some states, like South Carolina, are we don't register by party, so you can vote in either the Republican or the Democratic primary, which will obviously play a role in this weekend's election, with Democrats being able to vote as in the Republican primary if they didn't vote in the Democratic primary a few weeks ago. But other places, it's a closed primary where you have to be a Democrat to vote in a Democratic primary, or you can be an independent in places like Colorado, but you can have to choose which primary to vote in. So there's lots of rules across the board, which doesn't necessarily make it super easy to understand,
Yeah.
which we don't blame voters for. But we do hope to encourage more voter education and voter participation this election.
Gotcha. So I think we all struggle with just some disillusionment when it comes to our politicians as constituents. What do you think it's going to take to help these voters not to lose faith in the process? That we're seeing constant people like Trump going to court. You have Nikki Haley who's fighting to try to stay in a race that she's losing by far. But how do we keep voters from losing the faith?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that. I'll try to get into as many as I can here. I think the primary thing is that we all across the board have to realize that change can take time. And also, change takes time at different paces, depending on what level of government that you're working at,
Mhm.
right? So, at the federal level, it's pretty slow moving, right? Because it's dealing with all 50 states, right? And at the state and local level, obviously, even at the state level with statewide things, sometimes it can take a lot longer. But at your municipal level with your cities and your counties, things can happen a lot more rapidly, right?
Mhm.
So as someone with a background in municipal government, we would do things in the mayor's office, and it's like, oh, we have an idea, we can execute it tomorrow, right? Like it's really cool to see how things can happen so quickly, even depending on the size of your city, right? Columbia is not a large city, so things that happen as quickly in Columbia don't necessarily probably happen as quickly in New York City, right? Or even
Mhm.
DC, where you guys are, right?
Yep.
So it really just depends across the board. But the thing that I try to emphasize to people, regardless of their age, their background, their voter partisanship, whatever, I try to say, like, if you don't participate in an election, elected officials and candidates don't necessarily know that you are invested in this democracy that we participate in, right? And if people don't know that you're invested in it, they don't necessarily look to cater to your interests, right? So, particularly for Black voters, which I know we're going to talk about tonight as well, is like, hey, as a Black voter, please participate, right? Because
Yep.
the more Black voters that come out to elections, the more candidates and elected officials know they need to be able to win over Black voters based on their interests and their values, right?
Absolutely.
So when it comes to coalition building, obviously historically we've been the base of the Democratic Party. People say it all the time, blah blah blah. But obviously trends are changing and things are happening across the board where we need to make sure that we are still showing up to vote, because if we don't, people don't consider us when it's time to make policy changes and advance different policies, or they advance policies that they think are in our interests and they're not necessarily things that we align with necessarily.
Gotcha. Gotcha. Okay, let's move over to talk a little bit because you're an entrepreneur. Do you Was that something you set out to be after college, or it just came naturally after you started working on campaigns?
I don't know If I would say I was setting out to be an entrepreneur, I studied public relations in my undergraduate degree at the University of South Carolina, go
Hmm.
Gamecocks. And I wanted to be in communications. I love writing. My background in consulting even was writing, ghostwriting for my former mayor, for other clients that I've worked with, for speeches and talking points and blah, blah, blah. So I've really enjoyed writing, and it's something that I really enjoy. But the entrepreneurship element came out of kind of just a desire to do more work, particularly in my home state of South Carolina.
Hmm.
I was finding that there were a lot of awesome cities in our state, and they don't always have the bandwidth and the capacity to execute a vision from the mayor or from any other elected office member, because they don't have people who can help them to get plans made, write things out, execute plans, etc. So that's the reason why I started my business. It's not necessarily exactly what I do these days,
Hmm.
which is okay. But I do try to do what I can, obviously, in our electoral work and in our faction building work to get more representation that best represents the interests of the American people,
Hmm.
and looks like the American people and sounds like the American people, and actually is wanting to serve as true public servants to get things done, which is even going back to your former question about like why you should vote, is because if you're not electing people who you think are really representing you and your values,
Hmm.
then you are either electing people who aren't, or you're allowing people who really don't care about you to get elected into office, which can hurt you down the line.
Gotcha. Which is true. Very true. I mean, I look at the people of my home state of Florida, and just, oh my goodness, just a disaster. But hey,
Hot mess down there.
yeah, it's rough. My brother and I look at it like, and we grew up in that.
Yeah, yeah,
But we made it. We made it. We got out.
totally, totally.
Let's talk about your actual company, the Welcome Party, and let's talk about the Welcome Pack and how that works, because I think people would be interested to understand how packs work in general. So, whichever one you want to start with, please delight us.
Absolutely. So again, the Welcome Party, not to make a third party, but to make a more welcoming Democratic Party, we essentially do work to build out what we call the center-left faction of the Democratic Party. I'm a moderate Democrat. We're all working as moderate Democrats to essentially build out the center-left wing of the Democratic Party. If you have, like, obviously all politics on the spectrum, you have the Democratic Socialists on the far left, you have the MAGA Republicans on the far right, and then you have people in the center, whether it's center left or center right.
Mhm.
Center right people being kind of like the Nikki Haley's of the world, and center left being the Joe Bidens of the world, right? So, say all that to say, we believe that if we can understand how factions will work moving forward in our politics, that more people will understand that you can build political power in factions. Obviously, you see it with the Freedom Caucus and even with the Squad on the left, right? So,
Mhm.
when you are having factions that build out power with your interests, then you can advance policy and interests of the party in ways that you couldn't necessarily otherwise do. Welcome Party, like I said, big tent Democratic Party, wanting to obviously recognize and appreciate the diversity within our party, but welcoming in the moderate Republicans and the independent voters who don't feel like they can fit into the Republican Party anymore, and so welcoming them into the Democratic camp where we can get a lot of things done, particularly as we face lots of threats to democracy and whatnot. So the Welcome PAC is our electoral and PAC, super PAC arm of our organization, where we essentially back moderate Democratic candidates in conservative leaning congressional districts across the country.
Okay.
So, for example, this cycle, we're working in Scott Perry's district, Pennsylvania's 10th district. And we have built out coalitions called, Republicans Against Perry, where there are conservatives, Republicans who are openly stating, hey, I'm not with MAGAism, and I'm also not with insurrectionists like Scott Perry, right?
Hmm.
Scott Perry was involved in the January 6th insurrection. And there are a lot of conservatives who are, really about the Constitution. And they're like, I can't get down with that, right? I'm a
Exactly.
conservative, but I just can't get down with, overthrowing the government, right?
Yep.
So say all that to say, we build out coalitions with Republican validators, and then we use those Republican validators to help us elect Democrats in those districts. So the Pennsylvania Democratic primary is coming up in April, so we're super excited to see who comes out on top in that primary. And that person we're looking forward to being behind to take on Scott Perry in November. He has a vulnerable district. Um, uh, and we to take a step back, we look at these districts from a perspective of what we call conceding democracy districts. So these are districts, U.S. House congressional districts, or I should be specific, where we are finding that we are essentially conceding democracy to Republicans
Hmm.
by not running a formidable Democratic challenger who can raise money and really build coalitions. And also, these are places where Trump, what we call underperformed. So these are places where Trump got maybe 52, 53% of the electorate, which is
Hmm.
much higher than much lower than what he would have gotten in, say, South Carolina or Florida in most of those districts, right? And we're saying, hey, these are places where there's clearly a lot of moderate Republicans, because if it was a super Trumpy district,
Uh-huh.
they would have voted for Trump at 59, 66% of the electorate, right? They wouldn't have voted for him at just like 52, right? So these are places where we feel like we can invest in, build these winning coalitions among Democrats, moderate Republicans, and independents, and elect Democrats. And so that's the work of the Welcome Pack. This is our second cycle. We started our first cycle in 2022, backing Will Rollins running against Ken Calvert in California's 41st district,
Hmm.
as well as Adam Frisch, who ran against Lauren Boebert in Colorado's 3rd congressional district. And we're backing both of them again this cycle. And excited to see that Adam Frisch scared away Lauren Boebert. She's running Colorado's 4th now, and
Hmm.
so we're looking forward to getting a big Adam Frisch win this year, and we're super excited about that. But
Good.
again, just wanting to make sure that we really invest in places that we could win, we could pick up, and find ways so we can flip some districts blue that aren't necessarily being looked at.
Well, how do people even find you all to do this work? Like, in general, is it just you're already in this environment, so they say, "Hey, let's go to the welcome team or whatever." But are they like, how did they even find you to do this?
So in terms of candidates, we accept candidate inquiries all the time. We'll talk to pretty much anybody. I was talking to a really compelling candidate running in North Dakota the other day, Trigby Hammer. He's got a really interesting race, so check his race out this year.
Hmm.
But we specifically focus on the districts that we are looking to win this cycle,
Okay.
particularly, like I said, these districts that are specifically Trump 52, 53, 54% of the electorate. So it's really only about 35 congressional districts that we really, really look at. And then we pare them down to, a dozen or so districts that we really want to invest in
Okay.
an election cycle. Obviously, we want to do a good job where we're investing in versus, spreading out to, 40 districts, which cannot necessarily be as impactful. And we're not at that scale yet, if that makes sense. And so say that to say, there's a real opportunity, we feel like, for us to win in conservative leaning districts.
Okay.
And if we run the right moderate Democrat, we can pick up seats. And just obviously, having conversations with candidates. We have an independent expenditure arm of our PAC that does ads and stuff in those districts alongside the work that we're doing with the candidates. So we're really excited about this cycle and excited to pick up some seats this year.
Okay. That's great. Okay. Anthony Mitchell wants to run. What's his start for a local race? Not
It
state.
depends on what you're running
Just
for. You're running for mayor, you're running for city
let's
council, you
say
gotta be
mayor.
specific.
Mayor.
Uh, so you're like, you just want to, like, how do you get a campaign going, or?
Yep. I
Yeah,
think our
I
crowd
mean,
wants to know, what does it take? Young people out there.
so, well, one, you have to run with the not just the motives that are right, but also with the issues that are right. So you have to know what your community needs and wants and listen to them. So you should have an understanding of what do people want to see in a mayor. What are people frustrated about? What needs to be changed? What can be changed by that specific office versus at the state or federal level? And build a coalition, build up your brand, build up your name recognition in the place that you're running. Create coalitions for women, or for law enforcement, or for teachers, or for whoever, and raise some money. That's the big one.
Yeah, yeah, obviously. See? All right, so young people that are listening, this is your method in how you can run and run for an election cycle, in your town, because that's where it starts. It starts really on the local level. Let's dive into that a little bit. Why is it that it seems that minorities don't tend to go out and vote on the local elections as much as a historic primary, so to speak? it's always when they need us to come for the big presidential. But all of these smaller ones that you keep mentioning are the ones that really are the most important, when you say.
Absolutely. You definitely feel the repercussions of a mayor's executive order much quicker than you would a president's executive order, right? So I definitely think that it is important for us to show up at the ballot every time there's an election cycle. Um, I would just say, like, try to make it a habit, right? Get the election calendar on your phone calendar. Know when the primary elections are in your state. Know who's on the ballot for your general election. I know that some people I've seen like read in focus groups. People see like voting is like taking out the trash. You
Hmm.
have to do it, but you don't necessarily always want to do it. But
Yeah.
you got to do it, right? So I understand that, and I hope that we can get past taking out the trash as an ideology of how we feel about voting. But if that's how you have to get started, then at least try to build and cultivate a habit that keeps you in the game. Because,
Yep.
as I said, like if people are not participating in election cycles, people don't feel like they need to cater to their interests or to
Yep.
their, demographic overall, and that can harm us later down the line.
Yeah. Let's talk about the black voters in that same vein. Historically, they typically vote Democrat. We know years and years ago there were the Dixiecrats and things like that. But over these past years, a long time now, we typically vote Democrat. Why does it seem like it's such a struggle for the black males this time? At least that's what news is reporting, that black males don't tend to want to vote Democrat now. And they'll chalk it up as, hey, they're just listening more. They're not just accepting what a Democrat typically says or whatever. What do you think in studying to prepare for different election cycles?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that go into those questions there, but the one that comes to mind off the top of my head, I have a good friend, Joshua Doss. He works for this group called Hit Strategies, with ran by Terrence Woodbury. They do incredible polling and focus groups and put out great data about minority voters. And I was talking to him about what's going on with black men and black voters this cycle, and he was mentioning that. A lot of it stems from simply the way that we communicate with black men
Hmm.
as a demographic. He was saying that they did some type of testing where they said, they called it, like we're going to, as Democrats, we're going to give you the child tax credit and, pay, try to reduce child poverty in black families, blah, blah, blah. Right. And then I think they message tested with another thing, and they were saying like, well, we're going to empower men to be great providers for their families by offering them a tax incentive to build upon, blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
Right. And so it's like two different messages. I don't think fundamentally, amazing black men out there like yourself, they don't necessarily want a handout. They want to be empowered to do what they feel led to do. They want to be empowered to, lead in their communities, be, heads of their households, et cetera. And I think as Democrats, we do a poor job of articulating what we want to do for people with the wording that we use all the time, right? Again, a lot of people, a lot of conservatives, I should say, are saying like, "Oh, yeah, Democrats are just trying to always give somebody a handout."
Hmm.
Well, if you are on the receiving end of a Democratic quote unquote handout, then you're not going to necessarily feel empowered. You're going to feel like, a special case, right?
Hmm.
But people want to feel empowered, and I think that that comes simply as a repercussion of not a lot of black men in Democratic politics all the time, right? Especially at the staffing level. I have worked in Democratic politics for a while and have seen on Zoom after Zoom and meeting after meeting in person, et cetera. There's not a lot of people who look like me who are making decisions when it comes to democratic messaging. And I'm not necessarily saying that, white people suck. I'm not saying that. But
Yeah.
what I am saying
Understood.
is that when it comes to messaging, if you want to understand exactly how to talk to people, you probably need to include people who look like who you're trying to talk to, right? In the decision making, right? People who see it with brands all the time. They'll say like, "Oh, that was such a great ad from whatever corporation," and then somebody will be like, "It was really tone deaf because it didn't realize that people think this about this," right?
Yep.
So I think we just need to be very mindful, who is our messenger and what is the message, right? And how are we articulating that message in a way that makes people feel like they can be, again, empowered. They can be, advocates for their own communities and homes, et cetera. And I think we just are struggling with that as a party, and looking forward to more people like Joshua and Terrence who are going to help change that message
That's
moving
good.
forward.
It's good that they're doing that. Do you think that the relationship is broken with black
I
men
don't
and,
think the
and the
relationship
Democratic
is
Party?
broken necessarily. I think, well, let me take another step back again. So, when you ask about black men or even just black voters in particular, you have to also look at age. There is a very big difference between black voters under 40 and black voters over 40.
Mhm.
A lot of people under 40 are trending independent. Um, the Gen Z and millennial age demographic, is the most independent voting bloc that we've seen in I think historically ever.
Interesting.
Right, they're pretty much all independents. They're not Democrats, they're not Republicans, right? So that said, we can't necessarily just put people in a box anymore. And
Gotcha.
we probably should never have tried to do that to begin with, right? And so when we talk about how we message to people, allowing them to make a choice about who we think will best represent, who they think will best represent them, we need to be considerate in the language that they're using. And, just calling all Republicans terrible villains,
Hmm.
X, Y, and Z is not going to work anymore, right? We need to give them a reason why Republicans are not looking out for their best interest, and also presenting them with Democratic candidates who know what they stand for and again their values, right? We've been doing some where I think we even connected over this, but a piece that we put out at the end of last year about black voters being moderate. If you ask the median black voter, how do you identify, 43% of them say I'm a moderate, right? And 25% of them say I'm a conservative,
Hmm.
right? And so when you think about how black voters self-identify when asked, they're moderates and they're conservatives. They're
That's true.
not liberal. I think
Very true.
only 13% of them said they would self-identify as liberal.
Yeah.
And that said, you look at all of the Democratic narrative, especially in 2020's election cycle, not as much this cycle, hopefully, but 2020 cycle, they're saying like, oh, all Democrats want to defund the police, all black people want to defund the police. It's
Yeah.
like that's clearly not true,
Yeah.
right?
Not true at all. Yeah.
Your mother doesn't want no police when she calls,
Yep.
in her neighborhood. Your grandparents don't want that, and you don't want that, right? If you
Exactly.
if you want people, if you want first responders to show up at your house when there's an emergency, you want to make sure the police is funded sufficiently and efficiently to do that.
Very true. Very true. So, in your research and like talking with some of your counterparts, do you really think that black men are truly thinking of going for Trump, or no?
So I want to say it was 20% of black men voted for Trump in 2020.
Wow.
I think it's possible and likely that even more black men will vote for Trump in 2024. Again, there is just seems to be a very big disconnect culturally, among Democratic establishment, black cultural
Interesting.
stuff, economic messaging, right? Like when we look at just the sheer, like even like going back to the piece we talked about, black voters and independent voters are very, very similar when polled about different issues,
Hmm.
right? When it comes to the economy, they're happy that unemployment is low, but they want lower prices,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And when we cannot necessarily uh, do what we need to do to affect people's day-to-day pockets, whether it's at the gas pump or the grocery store, then
Hmm.
people feel that and people remember that and people think about that. It's not to say that President Trump again is going to change that for them, but if you as a voter, again, as a median regular average voter, if you feel that there's not a huge change between a Trump presidency and a Biden presidency in your day-to-day life,
Hmm.
you might go for the guy who happened to be before the guy now, right? And I'm not saying that that's the right thing to do, but I
Yeah.
think I can understand when people say that, well, my life didn't look any different or my life was better under Trump. Or like, it's like, I'm not saying that it's right, but day-to-day lives of people, I think people really underestimate just how much people think about those things.
You're right. You're right. And it's interesting. And I kind of use this story. I was talking to my sons about it at one point. It's interesting that so the first president I was able to vote for, and so this is dating myself. I mean, I just turned 50 in December. So, the first president I was able to
A
vote for.
blessing. That's a blessing.
It is. It is. So like I say, the first president I was able to vote for was Clinton, 1992. I turned 18. It was the first election I could actually be a part of, and that was a big deal because he really went after the youth. And my brother and I were talking about this, that during his presidency, it was nothing to get a job. Like you could easily just you could quit a job and within, because I was in college at that time. Also, I went to college after that, and you could quit a job and within the same week you'd have another job. That's how easy it was to get jobs.
Mm.
So years later, I'm older. President Obama gets in, and I was at this one job for about 8, maybe 9 years, and I was like, okay, time to make a change. Tried to, and President Obama was in office, and I couldn't get out of that place. Like
Mm.
nobody was hiring, and I'm like, I'm in information technology. This is the easiest career
Yeah.
field to get a job in, especially in Northern Virginia,
Yeah.
and nobody. Trump gets in. I get 3 job offers like it was nothing. And it was so interesting seeing. I almost felt like, okay, maybe they're being intentional. This is a part of everybody's attack on President Obama to keep a black male from being able to prosper or whatever. And I
Mhm.
almost felt like that. And
Mhm.
some of my counterparts, even a lot of my buddies, they're in good jobs or whatever you might want to call it, different career fields, law enforcement, and everything else. They had the same exact feeling. But
Interesting.
when Trump came in, they could all switch jobs. Some left the FBI, went in to become senior security people in FedEx and other companies,
Yeah.
and they couldn't do that when they were when President Obama was in. So it is kind
Mm.
of interesting. I kind of understand what people are feeling like from that perspective, from the financial side and the
Yeah.
prospect side. But
Yeah.
under the same breath, I still understand that that I don't think the days were better just because President Trump was in office at that point. So I don't know. A lot of things were being done against President Obama, just to spite him, but just my
Right.
thought,
Right.
you know. Um, let's talk about moderate. Moderate, because you mentioned that term a little bit ago. Moderate leaning left or whatever, moderate leaning right. Explain the moderate in general, and then explain from the 90s before. How are they different? Today's moderates versus the past.
Yeah, well, let me also date myself. I was born in 1993, so I'm only speaking from what I have read online.
Uh
Okay,
huh. Uh-huh.
but when it comes to moderate, let me be very clear. I am not someone who thinks that one, moderate has a very good definition, and two, that we need to be very adamant about what label we call ourselves.
Hmm.
We could be normal Democrats, we could be mainstream Democrats, we can be pragmatic Democrats, we can be moderate Democrats, we can be anything, right? Independent Democrats for that matter, right? I
Yep.
think we just need to understand that if you're a Democrat who is willing to work across party aisle, which is very much what I've, understood from the 90s. It was very much about bipartisanship,
Hmm.
making sure that you were able to work with both parties and not just be explicitly, gung ho on your own party's platform.
Yep.
Um, but say all that to say, I think the biggest thing is being willing to, one, introduce nuance and permit nuance in politics, and two, again, working with other people who may not agree 100% with what you agree with. One of the things that we value with the Welcome Party and Welcome Pack is when we talk about our candidates and accept candidates and endorse candidates for that matter, we don't send them a 40-page questionnaire with a litmus test of, are you this or are you this? Are
Hmm.
you this or are you this on this issue? And we're not saying that groups who did that are bad. Like, do what you want to do. It's at your organization. But when it comes to us, we want to be welcoming any type of Democrat who is willing to get things done and meet people where they are, not just geographically, but also ideologically, right?
Yep.
And when we say litmus test, when we say that, it's like, again, you don't have to be 100% purist on the Democratic Party's platform. If you're missing, boxes 6 through 12 or whatever,
Hmm.
and you still want to be a Democrat, you should be welcomed into our party, because the alternative is to do what you were referencing before, which is push people out of the party.
Yep.
people who are on, the extremist far left are very into pushing people out of the party, um, for the sake of essentially trying to progress their own desires policy wise, right?
Gotcha.
That is not how government works.
Nope.
It never has worked, right? In order to win and progress and advance ideas, you have to build coalitions. And building coalitions largely involves working with people who are meeting in the middle, right? Not just compromising, but negotiating, right?
Yes.
That's a big deal. Anybody who's worked and taken a negotiation class or whatever knows the promise of a good negotiator, right?
Hmm.
So I say all that to say, when it comes to our politics, the reason why again we do this work is because we feel like there's a lot on the line. We want to elect good people. We want to have a government that works for us. If you look at Congress right now, I think I saw another headline about a looming government shutdown. We have yet to, I think, advance the immigration bill that would also fund stuff for Ukraine and Taiwan and
Hmm.
everyone. Like, we really need to be serious about electing good leadership to Congress. And had we won 5 more seats last cycle, we're not
Yep.
talking about a dozen, we're not talking about 30, we're talking about 5 seats
Hmm.
between a Speaker Mike Johnson, who we have now, and a Speaker Hakeem Jeffries, which we could
Hmm.
have had we elected 5 more Democrats last cycle,
Exactly.
right? Again, and one of the things that we look at in terms of whether this is resonating is that Democrats who won in competitive districts won so with a message like the one that we are putting out and the one that we are advocating for, right? And they also won by larger margins than those who are running in different types of different districts, right?
Yep.
So if you are a Marie Gluesenkamp Perez who, narrowly won a really tight seat in Washington's 3rd congressional district against an extremist opponent and is again running against an extremist opponent this cycle, you have to be able to meet people in the middle.
Yep.
And like I've seen some stuff that her Republican challenge is putting out. It's kind of scary, to be quite honest, right? And if he were elected to Congress, he would be again with those Freedom Caucus folks doing absolutely insane stuff, right?
Hmm.
So I think the one thing that we need to remember as average Americans, right, is we don't necessarily have to love Republicans. We don't necessarily have to love Democrats, but what we should hate is people who get into office and are advancing ideas that are unsafe and that are essentially trying to unravel the type of government that we've already put together.
Interesting. Well said. Because I think overall, I think most people do want their politicians to just come together collectively and make good decisions, not just go off in the deep end, left or right. Let me ask you this. This is a question, and then we're going to let you get out of here so you can have your good evening. But why are the polls just so erratic? I mean, the past 3 to 4 congressional cycles and presidential cycles, I mean, things have just been off. What we're being told, just, you know, I don't know. I mean, I'm asking a pro. I'm asking you. Why are they just so off?
Well, I like to learn like the rest of us. And I think the problem is the experts claim to be experts. And this is not a field where you can be an expert, in my
Gotcha.
opinion. I think that you have to be a lifelong learner. You can become very advanced in your predictions. You can become very good at strategy, right? We consider ourselves pretty good democratic strategists, right?
Hmm.
But what I'm saying is like the polls, they haven't been as bad as people think they are. I think it's like when in terms of like last cycle, we thought there was going to be a red wave, etc.
Hmm.
It's just that there's so much like pressure on what exactly is going to happen every election cycle, that I think that people put so much faith into the polls when like the polls are just polling, right? They might oversample a group of people that gives them a perspective that is different than what is actually happening, right? If you over again, even going back to age, education, ethnicity, etc. If you oversample young Black people, you're going to end up with a result that's very different than if you oversample old white people, right? So it's
Correct.
just very like just be very mindful that the polls are polls. That's like
Yeah.
you going and talking to your friends and be like, okay, so how many of you think that we should do XYZ?
Yeah.
Some are going to say one thing and some are going to say the other, but again, it's just a poll.
Yeah.
But I do think that, again, based on like what I was saying, again, with like Democrats overperforming. Like we overperformed in swing districts, which is basically saying that the type of campaign you're running really does impact voter attitudes.
Uh-huh.
And I think that the more that we meet people where they are, um, uh, uh, provide a very distinct brand. We have a friend who does ads for Andy Bashir in Kentucky, Governor Andy Bashir in Kentucky, right?
Okay.
Governor Bashir was not running on a defund the police platform in Kentucky.
That's
Like,
true.
say that again. Like, he's a Democratic governor in Kentucky. First
Yeah.
of all, who would have thought that there'd be a Democratic governor in Kentucky, right? So if you think about it, again, you have to be very careful about what type of campaign you're running, where you're running in, and how you build a brand that is distinct from what people expect of you, essentially, as a Democrat, right?
Hmm.
If you're talking to people and you're like, yeah, I actually do agree with you on a lot of those things, and they're like, wow, I never thought that Democrats would agree with me. It's like, yeah, because we need to create this brand that is much more meeting people in the middle,
Uh-huh.
welcoming nuance within our politics, and not hating people just because they're a Republican. There are plenty of Republicans who probably would vote for you as a Democrat, but if you keep calling them all, bad names, they're going to say, well, why would I consider voting for you, right?
That's
So
true.
again, just be
That's
very
true.
mindful of the rhetoric that you're using. Be very mindful of the messaging that you're putting out to exclude people within the Democratic Party. Again, if we want to be a big tent, we have to show that. If we want Biden to win again in 2024, we have to prove that by catering to and wooing independents
Okay.
and the moderate Republicans who can, instead of voting for Trump, vote for Biden again this cycle.
Yeah.
And I think that there's just a lot of work that can be done in terms of, just again meeting people where they are.
Very cool. Very well said. And here's the thing. So a couple things before you get out. What are some things people can do to participate with your company or the PAC itself?
Absolutely. So we actually have this fun Act Blue page called Win the Middle.
Okay.
And we have, I think it's 9 or 12 something candidates in campaign committees that are doing the work to win the middle for this election cycle. So we have our candidate committees for Pennsylvania 10, Wisconsin's 3rd. We have awesome current members of Congress like Marie Gluesenkamp Perez and Jared Golden. We have awesome Black moderates like Janelle Bynum, who are just meeting people where they are ideologically. And so doing all this work to, create this Win the Middle fund where we do more of the work that we think is actually going to work this election cycle, and raising money for that. So you can.
Is that a website? Win the Middle?
winthemiddle.com. It sure
Okay.
is. Yeah. And then you can find us on, I think, everything at this point. We've gotten a lot of traction on Threads recently. So find us on Threads, find us on Twitter and Instagram. I think we're on Twitter at The Welcome Pack, on Instagram and Threads as Democracy on Offense.
Great.
And welcomepack.org is our website. So yeah, we'd love to connect with people and find out, more of what they want to hear about.
Awesome. Okay, I want to give you the last word. Talk to our audience and let them know what you want them to know about this year's election cycle and the importance.
Oh, yeah. Mic drop on this one. I don't know. Let's see. I would just say don't let fear motivate you, but look to be empowered in your politics. Stay engaged with local government. Send good vibes and pray for your elected officials who are in the White House and in Congress. There's a lot of crazy stuff going on, a lot of threats to even people's families and stuff. And that is not what we need to be doing here in America. So, do the best you can, encourage your friends and family members to vote. Just remind them like, hey, like if we're not voting, they don't care about us. Like, I hate to say it that way, but like that's pretty much true. Black vote was down in the midterms last election cycle, and I don't want to see that this election cycle. We really do need to get out there. We need to remind people that their vote matters, particularly in our amazing swing states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, etc. Not to say that your vote doesn't matter in a red state like South Carolina or anywhere else, but just be mindful that, you're not just electing a president, you're electing your city council, and you're electing your mayor, and you're electing all sorts of things. So get out there, vote, and stay engaged, because if not, got a long road ahead of us.
This is true. This is true. Okay, Madam Lauren Harper-Pope, thank you so much for stopping by the Media Society. I really appreciate having you. It was a wonderful thing getting the opportunity. I at first saw you on MSNBC, and I said, I'm going to get her on my show. And I took that chance. I said, let me just write her. I didn't think anything. A day or so went by. Next thing you know, you wrote back. I said, so very cool. It's been a delight having you on here. And like I said before, we owe you lunch. So anytime you're in the area, you let us know. We got you.
Absolutely. Thanks again for having me, Anthony. I enjoyed the conversation and looking
Thank you.
forward to more conversations in the future.